Okay, today we're going to be looking at the Amun cult. I originally was planning to look at Amenhotep the fourth, Amenhotep the third, and go into Akhenaten. But when I started writing up that presentation, I was just going, nope, we have to come back and cover one more thing before I get you all the way up to Akhenaten, because we need to know who the Amun cult was before we get there. Now, his Amun, he's an Egyptian god in Egypt. He's originally known as the Obscure One, Mysterious of Form, or the Hidden One. So, obscure means it means hidden. Okay? It's hard to see or hard to recognize, hard to define. Okay, and just because he was all those things, probably made it so he was more malleable. People could shape him. When you're malleable, you're shapeable, and so he was more malleable with the people. They could take the idea of him and shape him into something else. So Amun, he was the obscure one, the Lord of all, who encompassed all creation. So he had a little bit of everything. Now Amun, he is the statue there um, with the Ra symbol on top. So this is after a certain time, because Amun rose to prominence. And a lot of the gods of Egypt, they would have their local deities, or these little towns would have local deities. Just like in Mesopotamia, okay, your city would have a local deity that you worship. And Amun was a local deity. He was not the most powerful one to begin with at all, but he did become one of the most powerful ones, probably the most powerful one in all of Egypt. Now, he rose to prominence with the rise of the 18th dynasty. Um, the 18th dynasty, you have this man named Ahmose the First. And Ahmose the First, he overthrew the Hyksos. The Hyksos were Semitic people that came down from the north. They ruled Egypt for about 100 years, and in about 1550, 1525, I think at the beginning of 1550, Ahmose kicked them out and established the 18th dynasty. And as he did that, he gave credit to Amun. Okay, and that rose Amun's power up. Okay, whenever you went to war in the ancient times, frequently you went to war with your gods, and if you won, your god was more powerful. Now, with Hinduism, the Hindus made the people be their gods subservient to the main Hindu god, okay, Brahman. And this is what happens here in Egypt too. Okay, in Mesopotamia, when you conquered a god, typically you would destroy their god or take their god captive back to your city. And we'll see this later on when we look at the Israelite people. But anyhow, the god Amun was merged with the sun god Ra. So his name became Amun Ra. And he also became known as the creator of the universe and the king of all gods. So he was the most important one. Now, the statues we have there, I think that's Hathor, his consort, his wife, and their son. I'm not super great on the gods' names and stuff, but I believe those are them. Okay, the priests of Amun. Really, what we're looking at is the priests of Amun, because um, Amun Ra, that is a belief. Okay, he's a statue. He's not animated. He's not real. At least I don't believe that he's real. But those Egyptians would. And the priests and the priesthood back then was very different from our modern day idea of religion and priesthoods for the most part. Nowadays in Christianity, people go to churches and worship in a service. Same with Islam and Judaism. Okay, most of the Western religions, they have some sort of service. Muslims will have Friday prayers. Well, they'll go listen to the imam say the prayers and say some words. Um, Synagogues are a place of learning, and they will go listen to the rabbi give words for the religious faith and sing. But here in the ancient world, temples were set up for the gods. They weren't set up for people. And so people did not go into the temple, only the priests did. And we still have some religions that are somewhat like that. When I lived in Japan, the Buddhist temples were set up for the Buddhist priests to run and monitor. And we would go and visit the temple, but for the most part, there were very few services or ceremonies. unless you knew their calendar and you could actually catch them, which we actually did catch a couple. But they did have male priests and female priests, and they got paid the same. And they had similar duties, but the female priests would serve the female deities. The male priests would serve the male deities for the most part. There was some crossover. And like I was saying, they didn't have any sermons or prayers for the people, and the priests were there to serve the gods, not the people. Typically nowadays, if you have a dilemma or some trouble, you might go to your priest or pastor or imam or a rabbi and talk to them, and they might give you some advice. They may have had similar things to that, and we'll see when we get to the priests, but typically the priests were there to serve the gods, okay? And that they thought that God actually lived in the statue. Okay, the priest of the temple. Okay, you had the priest and high priestess, or the priest and priestesses got paid the same. They did essentially the same jobs. Now, the Hem-Netcher Tepi, the high priest, or the first servant of God, he or she was the only person that could be in the main room with the god. Okay. Now, I didn't put it on here, but there's two types of temples. They had mortuary temples, which was there to serve the dead, to keep the dead back to life, to remember their names, that sort of thing. And then you had these temples dedicated to the different gods. Now, you had priests that served the god. They sang, danced, did everything else, collected money, performed the ceremonies. Typically, as a rotation, too. A priest would go and serve the god for a month. Then they go back to their regular job. So they rotated through the year like that. And I'm not sure how long they'd have off, but you go back, live your daily life back home, doing whatever jobs you had. Then you come back and serve the temple again. Now, they had hour priests. Now, the hour priests, those are my favorites, because hour priests are the people that would monitor, they were astronomers, so they monitored the cycle of the year. They paid attention to the high days, the holy days, the festivals. They also are the people who interpreted dreams. And so they would bring people in, or if you had a dream, you'd go see an hour priest, and they might say, oh, these are the symbols that you've seen, and this is what it means. Now, the Sem priest, on the slide before this one, that was a drawing of a Sem priest. He had that leopard skin around him. But they would utter spells to keep the dead eternal life. And so they would be the ones that would say the certain things to keep them alive. It's fascinating to see how spells transfer, because I think in we might hear witches or someone else cast spells, and that might be it. You got to say the prayer just right for the spell to work. Okay, Wab priests, these were the bottom. Okay, and there was a hierarchy of priests from top to bottom. Now, the Wab priests, they did all the menial tasks. They kept the temple clean. They served the maintenance, all that, to make sure that things were running properly. But all priests were trained. Okay, so when you became a priest, you had a training and expectations that you would have to perform. It wasn't just like, hey, you're a priest now. Okay, you had responsibilities. Now, the temples. This is the temple of Luxor, and we'll see the outlay of it here in a minute. But Luxor is a temple in Thebes that is dedicated to Amun, and you can see the scale of it. Now, this would have been covered. Now, one thing to know, or look at and notice, is all those columns within that temple, and then you'd have courtyards. Now, the columns were there because you couldn't support that roof all the way across without multiple columns. So there's an engineering problem here. Stones are pretty fragile, and they're very heavy. And so you can't just lay one stone across. Now, the stone that lays across the top of there, it's called a lintel. And you'd have other smaller, you might even go to wood up there at the top, that would support your roof. But to get a big indoor space was very difficult. And to get a big indoor space without columns in the ancient world was virtually impossible. When we get to Rome, we will see one of the largest indoor structures of the world, the Pantheon, and it's my favorite building. Okay, but the temples, they continued to work on them And so Tutmos the first, he's the first one to build this. And you can look at the temple here. It looks like this section right here was the very first part of the temple that they built. Tutmos the third. Okay, now if you paid attention, the third, Tutmos the third is the son of Hatshepsut's husband. Okay, and so we can see some of the things that he may have built. And you can look around to see the additions. Okay, eventually, it takes them several hundred years to build most of this temple. Ramses II builds this dark outline around it in the Hippo style. That's the columns we saw on the other one. Okay, now some of the primary rituals. They did have daily rituals, and these are two of the daily rituals. They believed that Ra, the sun god, would set in the west and go by boat across the River of the Dead, I believe, to the east. And when Ra, the sun god, did that, he would pass by this serpent god Apophis, and Apophis would try to eat him. And so the priests in the morning would get up before dawn and light a fire, the morning fire, and that fire was kind of like a beacon, drawing Ra toward the sunrise. Now, the other thing that they do is they draw the bolt, because they would lock the door, and that bolt refers to the lock. Okay, they draw the bolt to the god's most holy chamber. Then the priests would go in there and, dress the god, bathe the god, make sure the god was ready for the day. Okay. Now, I'm not sure. I did tell you earlier that only the high priest would be in with the main god, but I think when I was reading this, like, you had other people in there helping him out. Maybe not, maybe so. But drawing the bolt where they let the high priest, only the high priest could live in that room. Maybe that's what it says. But it's fascinating to look at these things. Okay, growing power. Now, at the end of the Old Kingdom, and before the first intermediate period, so we're looking about 2000 BCE, the temples were given exemptions from paying taxes. It's fascinating to think about that. But a lot of history, you'll have kings and queens and pharaohs giving tax exempt status to the churches. In fact, the United States gives tax exempt status to our churches. We're all religious people. Now, in this time frame, the priests, they own land. The temples own land, and they could actually collect rents for their land. They could sell their crops. They also collected offerings because people wanted to be on the good side of God. The priests were there to keep chaos back and to make sure that the world operated appropriately. And so when you were thought something was happening to you, you might pay the priests, give them an offering, but they had an income beyond that. Now, priests, it's fascinating. They would actually, about the 18th dynasty or before, you had priests that actually pay to become a priest or to become the high priest, because that would mean you got a better income. It was a way to get wealth and power. And so the higher up of the priesthood you were, the more lucrative a contract you would have, the more power you'd have, the more money you'd have. And I did see that when Akamosa, he built a boat called the Bark and sailed it down to Thebes to honor Amun. But his boat that he had built was nothing compared to the priests' barks, their boats, because they were that much more wealthy than Akamosa. Now, as time went on, the cult of Amun was more powerful and wealthy than the pharaoh. Now, the pharaoh would name who the high priest was, but the power system is beginning to flip here. The pharaoh is powerful, but then you have the priests who are becoming more powerful. If you remember back to Egypt, not Egypt, but Hinduism, India, the priests were at the top of the pyramid. Then you had the pharaoh. Then you had the kings and queens, and that's what's happening here. And there's still a struggle between the two. Now, when we get down to Amenhotep IV, he had to take action, and I didn't put the question on there, but what type of action do you think you might take to get control of the priesthood? Okay, today, what I want you guys to do. Now, if you're not here to do this, you'll have to answer these questions on your own. But I want a discussion. Okay, how should government and religious organizations work together? Next question is, what should religions be taxed? And if so, why? If no, why? Okay, and is there a certain point that religion should be taxed? Now, what is the cost and benefit of taxing religions? Okay, because if you tax a religion, what does that cost society? What does it benefit society? And I don't have any right answers to this, and we could have a pretty good discussion with this. So I hope you're here for that discussion today. Look forward to talking to you guys, and have a good day.